Good day, all. As a case study in my series of talks on how health and healthcare work, I shall now examine the medical issue of transgenderism. As with all of the topics I examine, I shall look at both history and theory. This talk will examine the history of transgenderism, and my next talk will provide a theoretical analysis of transgenderism using all four sociological theories. Why transgenderism? Because it's everywhere. Whether in social media or legacy media, hardly a day goes by without another transgender story making the news. Indeed, in the 21st century, transgenderism has exploded, both in the public consciousness and in case volume. At the start of the century, clinics in Britain and Canada, for example, had virtually no transgender cases. Today, specialized clinics in both countries have thousands. In the US, transgenderism diagnoses rose from over 15,000 in 2017 to over 42,000 in 2021 and continue to rise sharply. In Canada, the 2021 census found that about 60,000 Canadians identified as transgender, and in the US, it's been estimated that about 1.4 million Americans identify as transgender. These numbers make transgenderism a development on a social scale, and so an appropriate issue for sociology. While I shall briefly look at the psychology of transgenderism, I shall primarily examine it as a social movement. As I said in an earlier talk, some health problems are better understood than others. Transgenderism is a recent development, so it is not yet fully understood. There is no scientific consensus on either its causes or its treatment. No biological cause has yet been found, although some studies hint that one may yet be forthcoming with further research. However, this is far from certain. This scientific uncertainty has led to considerable confusion in society at large. Transgenderism is defined here as attempting to become a different gender from the one a person was born as through medical intervention. Transgenderism is based upon gender dysphoria, which is a subjective feeling of being uncomfortable with one's birth gender and having a desire to change it. Gender dysphoria is the subjective basis for the objective process of transgenderism, and so it is the underlying psychological condition. However, since transgender is by far the more widely known term, I shall refer to this phenomenon as transgenderism. I am aware that some transgender persons consider the term transgender acceptable, but the term transgenderism unacceptable. But, to my mind, if the adjective is acceptable, then so must be the noun. It is at root the same word. Besides, as a sociologist, I've spent half my life studying isms. If none of those are offensive, then I don't see why transgenderism should be. As I said, this talk will focus on history. However, presenting the history of transgenderism is not so simple, because there is some debate as to when this history begins. Transvestism, or cross-dressing, has existed for thousands of years. And, through the centuries, there have also been occasional cases of persons who adopted a gender role which did not correspond with their biological gender. the transgender movement has claimed these as evidence that transgenderism has always existed. However, there's a world of difference between changing your clothes and changing your genitals. Most modern transvestites or drag queens have expressed no interest in undergoing the transgender procedure. Transvestism is not transgenderism. Likewise, some women in the past have pretended to be men in order to circumvent the legal restrictions against women gaining an education or a career which existed up to the early 20th century. But this does not mean that they believed that they were really men. Transgenderism, in the modern sense of changing one's gender through chemical and surgical intervention, only became possible due to the medical advances which began in the early 20th century. The first transgender procedures were developed in Germany in the 1920s and 30s and spread to the rest of Western Europe and North America in the 50s and 60s. The term transgender was only invented in 1965 by psychiatrist John Oliver. So, my history will focus on the 20th and 21st centuries. The remarkable thing about this history is that, even though it is relatively short, it has seen radical changes in terms of numbers, gender, age, and organization. In the early 20th century, there were a few transgender cases, but in far smaller numbers than these days. In addition, almost all of them were prepubescent boys who declared that they were really girls. Such declarations would commonly begin around the age of 4 or 5. In other words, long before these children knew what sex was or what the biological differences between the genders really were. This was a child's fantasy, an elaborate game of pretend. Boys saw girls doing things which they were told not to do. So, to get around adults' rules, they claimed to be girls themselves. Tell a child that they can't do something, and doing it immediately becomes the most important thing in their lives, until something else catches their attention. But these claims were based on wanting to adopt some aspect of girls' social role, not their genitalia. Not surprisingly, time showed that for most of these children, this was just a phase which they naturally grew out of after a few years. The majority of the remainder eventually realized that they were homosexual, and that this was the source of their so-called effeminate impulses. Only a handful went on to go through the transgender procedure, but almost all of this handful was male. This is how the situation remained up to the 1970s. Since the early 80s, however, we have not only seen an explosion in transgender cases, we've seen transgenderism go from an overwhelmingly male phenomenon to an overwhelmingly female phenomenon. Moreover, the age bracket for first onset of symptoms has also changed. Boys would claim to be girls while they were prepubescent, but would commonly abandon such thoughts when they hit puberty and found themselves sexually attracted to girls. For most, transgenderism was a phase which lasted at most through the ages of about 5 to 15 and then passed. But the girls who began to self-identify as transgender in the 80s normally did so starting at the age of 14 or 15, with no such claims stretching back to early childhood. This phenomenon has been termed rapid onset gender dysphoria. In other words, deciding virtually overnight that you are transgender. In Britain, the year 2018 alone saw a staggering 4,400% rise in teenage girls declaring themselves transgender. In Canada today, about 80% of those who initiate the transgender procedure are teenage girls. Teenage girls have become the core social group embracing transgenderism. The transgender movement has claimed that transgenderism is an innate part of humanity. However, if this was so, then as it has become more publicized and socially accepted, one would expect persons of both genders and all ages to declare themselves to be transgender. But the reality is that the overwhelming majority are or began as teenage girls. Another change which has taken place in transgenderism is that the young boys who lay claim to it in the early 20th century were individual cases, with no contact between them. But in the late 20th century, whole groups of female teens simultaneously decided that they were transgender. The problem with this is that transgenderism affects an estimated 1 in 1,000. So the odds against a whole group of girls simultaneously being transgender are literally astronomical. In the 80s, a different type of change also came to transgenderism. The transgender movement got organized. This was based on the major increase in the transgender population, which began in the early 80s, but many of the organizers were not themselves transgender. This self-organization was facilitated by the coming of the internet in the 90s and has continued in the 21st century. There are now over 20 transgender organizations in the US and a similar number in other countries. Transgenderism has become a well-organized movement. At first, this organization was defensive. It sought to protect transgender persons from the various forms of harassment to which they have been subjected. This has ranged from ridicule from passers-by to discrimination in the workplace, difficulties in obtaining health care, physical and sexual assault, and even homicide. Even homicide. The Human Rights Campaign Foundation began to track transgender homicides in the US in 2013 and has documented about 30 such homicides per year, including 32 in 2022. Since 2008, the transgender organization Transrespect versus Transphobia Worldwide has documented over 300 such homicides per year worldwide, including 375 in 2021. The figures compiled by both organizations show a slow but steady increase in violence towards transgendered persons. While there were, of course, already laws in place against assault and homicide, the transgender community put pressure on governments to provide them with better protection, and in the 21st century, most Western countries have passed laws against transgender discrimination and trans bashing. I fully support such measures, although, so far, they do not seem to have reduced or even halted the rise in levels of violence towards transgendered persons. But the movement did not stop there. Buoyed by their successes, in the 21st century, the movement went on the offensive. Anyone who disagreed with it was immediately subjected to a systematic and well-organized social media hate campaign. Such persons were publicly and repeatedly labeled as bigots, prejudiced, and generally bad people. The days when transgenderism was stigmatized are long gone. In the 21st century, it is opponents of transgenderism who are stigmatized and submitted to public shaming as part of a fear campaign to silence opposition to the movement. This is the technique, pioneered by the Nazis, which has become known as the big lie. Loudly proclaim the exact opposite of the truth and shout down and intimidate into silence anyone who says differently. But, as Ryan Anderson, author of When Harry Became Sally, has said, quote, "Biology is not bigotry." Insisting that basic, universal biological truths, such as that boys are not girls, be acknowledged is not hate speech, it is science. While there is anti-transgender hate speech in society and on the internet, legitimate medical and scientific concerns should not be lumped in with it. But for the movement, all disagreement is automatically termed hate speech. This is where calling something hate speech is itself hate speech. Anti-transgender hate speech comes from many individuals and is not to be dismissed lightly. But its social impact is minor compared to the organized and targeted hate campaigns which have been created by the transgender movement. Where does this hatred come from? It begins as a reaction to the hatred and violence to which transgender persons have been subjected. Hatred is a feedback loop and an escalating spiral. Hate begets more hate, just as violence begets more violence. However, this means that while hate campaigns may attain the movement's immediate goals, over the long term they only fuel anti-transgender sentiment. The hate grows on both sides. In addition, transgender persons have another motivation. When they realize that having their genitals amputated has not brought them the happiness they thought it would, many commit suicide and others detransition. But some take their disappointment, frustration, anger, and pain and channel it into hate, which they direct at anyone who points out what a terrible mistake they've made. The movement has even invented its own insult to level at its critics: transphobic. Now, as I just said, anti-transgender sentiment and even violence most certainly do exist and are to be condemned. But the movement has used the term much more broadly. The vast majority of those labeled as transphobic have simply spoken or written against the movement's goals, as I am doing here. One of the problems with this is that, strictly speaking, the term transphobia is another of the movement's made-up fantasy concepts. It doesn't exist. A phobia is an irrational fear of something. For example, I have arachnophobia. Just the sight of a spider nearby is enough to make me scream and jump. I know of nobody who has such a reaction to transgender persons, nor does the movement use the term to mean this. Transphobia could also potentially refer to the perfectly rational fear of being socially attacked and verbally abused by transgender activists. But of course, that is also not how the movement uses the term. Rather, a transphobe is simply anybody who refuses to accept the movement's claim that boys are girls. A rational and normal belief has been redefined as an irrational prejudice by a campaign of labeling and intimidation. These hate campaigns were then followed up by putting pressure on employers to fire their targets. This pressure has had notable successes. For example, Dr. Kenneth Zucker, a leading child psychologist who for decades headed the Child, Youth and Family Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto, was unceremoniously fired in 2016 because he refused to go along with the new so-called gender affirmative policy, which should really be called a transgender affirmative policy, consisting as it does of encouraging young people to go through the transgender procedure. Dr. Zucker instead believed that his job should be to, quote, help children feel comfortable in their own bodies. This position has a valid scientific basis, since there have now been numerous studies which have shown that a majority of cases of gender dysphoria resolve themselves over time without the need for chemical and surgical intervention, including some studies which have concluded that up to 98% of children who identify as transgender come to accept their true biological sex by the time they reach adulthood. Since Dr. Zucker's position was shared by his co-workers, the whole clinic was shut down shortly after his dismissal. This shutdown was based on an external review which levelled a number of criticisms at the clinic, all of which boiled down to condemning its preference for therapy over surgery. This was hailed by transgender activists as a victory for their cause and the culmination of a year-long systematic attack against the clinic, which they had orchestrated in social media and legacy media. However, this joyful attitude was not shared by the parents of children who'd been getting genuine and much-needed help at the clinic. In interviews, such parents were overwhelmingly supportive of the clinic and lamented its loss. A still more well-known example is that of Canadian psychologist and psychotherapist Dr. Jordan Peterson, who had to retire from his therapy practice after he posted a podcast critical of transgenderism, because the transgender movement launched a massive hate campaign against him, making it impossible for him to continue working, except as a podcaster and public speaker. In addition, the 21st century has seen growing numbers of so-called detransitioners, people who decide that going through the transgender procedure was a mistake and have it reversed as far as that is possible. They are treated as traitors to the cause and are submitted to similar hate campaigns. For example, Chloe Cole has said that as soon as she informed the internet transgender community that she was detransitioning, all of the persons who had previously been welcoming and supportive immediately switched to vilifying her online. This demonstrates that despite their claims to be her new family, these people never actually cared about her as a person, just as a recruit to their movement. As the media hate campaigns and job dismissals mounted, the message came across loud and clear: mess with the transgender movement at your peril. Psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, scientists, teachers, and politicians were all pressured to go along with the movement's goals. The doctors who perform the transgender procedure have been pressured into betraying their own Hippocratic oath, which famously begins, "First, do no harm." But there is already considerable scientific evidence that this procedure harms both the physical and mental health of those who submit to it. In addition, most medical and scientific journals quickly gave in to this pressure and established policies that they would only publish articles which supported the movement. Articles which presented countervailing scientific evidence were banned. Scientific impartiality be damned. Even stating the basic scientific fact that gender dysphoria is a mental illness was automatically judged to be transphobic and was prohibited, thereby making publication of any critical scientific investigation into this phenomenon impossible. This censorship has given the general public the impression that there is a scientific consensus that supports the movement, even though no such consensus exists. It has also permitted the movement to attack all of its critics as, quote, unscientific, even though many are working scientists. How is it that so many scientists have accepted a position for which there is not the slightest shred of scientific evidence, namely, that the transgender procedure is necessary and beneficial? Because, as sociologists have established, scientists are people too. And, like most people, they yield to threats of dismissal from their jobs. This betrayal of scientific principles by scientists is unfortunate, but far from unprecedented. For example, as I said in my talk on the war on drugs, for close to a century, most of the Western medical establishment yielded to political pressure and supported the criminalization of marijuana with claims that it was supposedly very harmful to people's health in various ways. It took decades of countervailing pressure by organizations like NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, to get enough genuine scientific research done to prove that all of these claims, like those of the transgender movement, were completely fictitious. Today, the Canadian Medical Association, the US Surgeon General's Office, and growing numbers of governments have acknowledged that the anti-marijuana campaign never had the slightest scientific basis and are abandoning it. Someday, the same will happen with transgenderism. But, so far, the movement is better organized than its opponents, and so it has been able to generate more social and political pressure. Most egregiously, in my opinion, teachers were instructed by school authorities, on pain of dismissal, that they must teach their students that there's no difference between boys and girls, and that gender is a matter of individual choice. Teachers have in effect been turned into recruiters for the movement. In some school classes, encouraged by a pro-transgender teacher, 20 to 30% of the class have declared that they are transgender. As a former educator, I am appalled that the movement has been successful in forcing teachers to teach things which are blatantly counterfactual and which can only lead to confusion and both mental and physical health problems for young people. I would compare their campaign to that of the National Rifle Association, the NRA, in the US, which has pressured politicians and lawmakers into accepting individual gun ownership, even though getting shot is also bad for people's health. In addition, the movement has fought for control of society's use of the English language. This has included pressure for the passage of laws such as Bill C-16, passed in Canada in 2017, which make it illegal to refer to transgender persons in any terms other than the ones they've made up to describe themselves. Bill C-16 is primarily intended to protect transgender persons from hate speech and discrimination. But lawyer Jared Brown has stated that if a transgender person were to file a formal complaint against someone who refused to use their chosen pronoun, that person would potentially face a fine or even jail time. Freedom of speech must be pushed aside to accommodate the movement's wishes. In particular, the 2010s saw the emergence of the Great Pronoun Debate. Transgender activists claim that, in addition to being able to determine their own gender, they can also determine their own pronouns. Even though the whole point of the movement is supposedly to change from one gender to the other, the movement has decided that the pronouns of neither gender are applicable to them. Rather, they are a separate gender or genders, and so need separate pronouns. Although a wide variety of made-up pronouns has been suggested, the most common proposal is to refer to a single individual in the plural, so that he or she becomes they or them. This is similar to the ancient tradition of the royal we. Monarchs are referred to in the plural to demonstrate their higher status from the common person. Transgender persons see themselves as a new form of royalty, a gender elite who must similarly receive recognition and tribute from society as a whole. Since transgenderism was born in Nazi Germany, it is not surprising that it contains this echo of the Nazis' master race ideology. Transgenders are the new master gender, rewriting the English language and defining today's social reality for everyone. The rest of us common folk have also been given a new label. We are no longer just human. We're now cisgender. The transgender movement has not only claimed the right to name themselves, but to name the whole human race. It is a term that I personally find demeaning, derogatory, and insulting. There's a clear implication that transgender persons are in a special and superior category to those who are merely cisgender. But of course, common people like myself are not allowed to be offended by being labelled. That privilege is reserved for the transgender royalty. According to the movement, everyday words like he and she are offensive. But freshly made up words like cisgender and transphobic are not. I disagree. The movement has also launched an assault on the word gender. activists have sought to muddy the waters by making this word effectively meaningless. Articles have been published, some even in scientific journals, claiming that the number of genders is not 2, but variously 7, 11, 16, 58, 68, 74, 94, or 96. This is already far more genders than the average person can be expected to remember or know, and this number can be increased indefinitely because it is underpinned by the claim that there is a so-called gender spectrum consisting of a potentially infinite number of genders. The basis for this, in turn, is the claim that gender is not objective but subjective. You are whatever gender you think you are, even an imaginary one. Potentially, every individual can supposedly be their own gender. This would make the very word gender redundant. It could be replaced by person or individual. But is there any other word in the English language, or any language, with infinite meanings? No. If there were, dictionaries would have to be infinitely long. But there are no such words, because a word with infinite meanings could mean anything, and so for practical purposes would mean nothing. The transgender movement seeks to destroy the very concept of gender, even though it is arguably the most basic human concept of all. Without gender, there is no reproduction. Without reproduction, there is no human race. But since transgender persons can no longer reproduce, this is not an issue for them, although it is for the rest of humanity. The movement keeps coming up with more and more everyday words which it claims to find offensive and in need of replacement. In February 2023, the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, or EEB, language project, which has brought together a number of woke scientists from Canada and the US, declared that all gender-based terms were, quote, unintentionally harmful to the transgendered, and so needed to be removed from all scientific publications and eventually from the English language. These include man and woman, masculine and feminine, and even father and mother. Men are to become XY individuals or sperm-producing individuals, while women are to become XX individuals or egg-producing individuals. Similarly, fathers become sperm donors and mothers become egg donors. In the future, if the transgender movement has its way, mothers will look at their daughters and say, "Hello, dear XX individual, I'm your egg donor." This will never happen, for two reasons. Firstly, because it's ludicrous. Secondly, because it's insulting. In their rush to make sure that they do not offend a tiny minority, it has apparently never occurred to these woke scientists that they're offending the rest of the human race. I am a father, and being a father is far more than just being a sperm donor. A sperm donor is someone who makes a donation to a sperm bank. A father is someone who loves and cares for his children. To reduce one to the other is both inaccurate and insulting, and anyone who can't tell the difference between them has no right to call him or herself a scientist. My wife, Amanda, is similarly insulted at being referred to as an egg producer, as though she were a type of chicken. Moreover, she has now reached the age where she no longer produces eggs? Does this mean she should be referred to as a former egg producer rather than a woman? In what world would this not be offensive? Oh, that's right, in the fantasy world of transgenderism. Mercifully, not all scientists support the EEB's goals. For example, Professor Frank Furedi at the University of Kent has said, quote, "I think that when you characterize terms like man and woman, mother and father as harmful, you're abandoning science for ideological advocacy." Moreover, the EEB project is not only unscientific, it is self-contradictory. However many pairs of made-up terms the project comes up with, it is just confirming the objective reality that gender consists of pairs, whether you call those genders men and women or sperm producers and egg producers. Human reproduction requires two genders, no more, no less. Gender is innately and biologically binary, and imposing so-called non-binary terminology on science would turn all of anatomy and biology and most of the sciences from sense into nonsense. Indeed, these new terms only demonstrate the fictional nature of transgenderism, since even the most committed activist must admit that there is no medical procedure in the world that can make a sperm producer into an egg producer, or vice versa. Genital amputation cannot make a man produce eggs or a woman produce sperm. The movement is seeking to mutilate the English language to match its mutilation of the human body. This mutilation is similar to that performed by Newspeak in George Orwell's 1984. Like Newspeak, it is based on an irrational way of thinking called doublethink, which allows you to believe two contradictory things at once. In 1984, Big Brother imposes doublethink and newspeak on society. In the real world, it is the transgender movement doing so. Its thinking is a clear extension of Big Brother's. War is peace, freedom is slavery, and boys are girls. Orwell concluded that, quote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. In today's world, freedom is the freedom to say that boys are not girls." Allow me to briefly list some of the terms through which the transgender movement has attempted to warp the English language and thereby warp society's thinking. This list is far from complete, but covers the most commonly used terms. They all refer to concepts which are non-existent and nonsensical. I have provided definitions in terms of the real world, rather than the transgender fantasy world. We begin with the very word, transgender. There's no such thing. It is not possible to change a person's gender. Transitioning. There's no such thing. Surgery can amputate the gender you were born as, but it cannot give you a new gender. Transphobia. There's no such thing in that there is no widespread fear of transgenderism. While anti-transgender sentiment does exist, the term has been used much more broadly to refer to anyone who refuses to believe that boys are girls. Cisgender. There's no such thing. There is only the human race. Assigned gender. There's no such thing. While society does create gender roles, gender itself is not assigned by any person or persons. It is determined by biology. Gender neutral. There's no such thing. Everyone has a gender, except for those transgender persons who've been surgically neutered. Gender spectrum or infinite genders. There's no such thing. People are male or female. Those are the only options. Non-binary. There's no such thing. Human biology is binary, either male or female. Those are the only options. 2SLGBTQIA+. There's no such thing. People are heterosexual, homosexual, or both. Those are the only options. They for she or he. There's no such thing. Singular is not plural. Finally, boys or girls. There's no such thing. Freedom is the freedom to say that boys are not girls. I categorically reject the transgender movement's basic premise that words which have been in everyday use for thousands of years have suddenly become offensive just on their say-so. I reject the premise that a small group of mentally ill persons have the right to tell me and the rest of the world how to speak and how to think. As far as I'm concerned, if you have a problem with the English language, then that's your problem, not mine. If words like he and she can be declared offensive, then there is literally not a single word in the language that is not a potential candidate for the transgender movement's ever-growing cancel culture. After he and she, what's next? And thee? Taking offense is easy. For example, I am of Polish background and I speak fluent Polish. The correct Polish pronunciation of my surname is Bierzeński. Every Pole that I have spoken to has had no problem pronouncing my name correctly, but non-Polish speakers are apparently incapable of doing so. Literally every English-speaking person I've ever met, including even my wife, has consistently mispronounced my name. And yet, what defines a person's identity more than their own name? Is not saying my name wrong even more offensive than using the wrong pronoun? But does this give me the right to take offense at all English speakers? Does it give me the right to say they are causing unintentional offense which must be eliminated from the language? To call them all Polish-phobic bigots? And demand that they all take a language course and learn proper Polish pronunciation before they address me or say my name? No. Because I recognize that none of them are deliberately being offensive and that I am in a linguistic minority. I recognize that taking offense would be childish and unrealistic. But the transgender movement is apparently incapable of recognizing this. And what about offense towards the rest of us from transgenderism? As far as I'm concerned, every single newly made-up word in the transgender vocabulary is profoundly offensive to me personally, and indeed, whether they know it or not, to over 99% of the human race. Every one of these terms distorts reality and pushes society as a whole towards literal insanity. Every single one of them is offensive, not because of some arbitrary emotional reaction, but because they force people to say things which, like Big Brother's doublethink, are not only untrue, but also irrational. But society is supposed to just accept these insults because only transgender persons have the right to be offended? I call bullshit on the whole transgender effort to take control of the English language. Transgender activists have created a public image of themselves as human rights activists. As such, the movement has acted as a social parasite, piggybacking on the accomplishments of other human rights movements, including the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement, and the Indigenous Rights movement. They have presented themselves as a natural extension of these movements, taking them to the next level. The problem with this public image is that transgenderism is not only not a human rights movement, it actively undermines the other genuine human rights movements I just mentioned. The women's movement was the first gender identity movement to emerge, and since it has the largest support population, half the human race, it is the most powerful such movement. Yet, even as it supposedly supports the women's movement, in practice, transgenderism undermines key accomplishments of this movement. Women have carved out distinct social spaces for themselves. Women's clubs, women's awards, women's sports, women's gyms, women's locker rooms, women's shelters, women's prisons, even women's washrooms. According to transgenderism, any man can enter these spaces just by declaring that he now self-identifies as a woman. A thoroughgoing application of this principle would first of all destroy institutions like women's sports. Having their genitals amputated would not eliminate the physical advantage that men have in growing up bigger and stronger than women. We have decades of results from sporting events which demonstrate that male athletes run races faster, jump higher, throw further, lift greater weights, and so on, than female athletes. Transgender athletes born male could come to dominate women's sports, thereby making them meaningless. Many female athletes have made this point, but their protests have been brushed aside as sports federations have rushed to establish their political correctness. In 2021, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, accepted transgender athletes in women's Olympic sports. The IOC is normally the most prestigious body in world sports, but in recent years that prestige has eroded. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the IOC at first banned Russian and Belarusian athletes from the Olympics. Similar bans were swiftly adopted by most international sports federations. But within months, the IOC reversed itself, saying that Russian and Belarusian athletes could compete under phony neutrality banners. This policy has already drawn protests from over 30 countries. However, at the moment, the IOC seems determined to be as inclusive as possible, even if that means including the representatives of warmongers and child abusers. In 2023, following the IOC's lead, the World Surfing League, the WSL, announced that transgender athletes could now compete in the women's category. In response, professional surfer Bethany Hamilton has said that if the policy is upheld, she will withdraw from the WSL as she can see little future for women's surfing. she was immediately subjected to a standard transgenderist media hate campaign. This has left her saddened but undeterred, declaring, quote, "I strive to have love for all of mankind, but now all the ladies see what a hateful and cruel world it can be, where people sit behind their screens and choose to spew awful things and tell you to be quiet. To me, that is a scary world to shut up debate and conversation. I believe that is very wrong." She is far from being the only person to make such comments. It is being increasingly recognized that hate speech, censorship, and intimidation have become the hallmarks of the transgender movement. However, not all sports federations have allowed themselves to be intimidated. In 2023, swimming's world governing body, FINA, announced that transgender men could only compete in women's competitions if they had undergone the transgender procedure before experiencing, quote, "any part of male puberty," which normally begins at age 12. Since most countries ban this procedure at such a young age, this ruling effectively keeps transgender men out of women's swimming competitions, as it should. Even more harmful than the destruction of women's sports, I would argue, is that transgenderism would take away those spaces where women feel safe from a male presence, which may include male violence. This has already begun in Canada. The staff of a women's shelter that refused to allow in a transgender man were accused of transphobia and threatened with dismissal, even though they pointed out that they were only following the wishes of the women in the shelter, most of whom said that they did not feel comfortable or even safe with a man in a woman's shelter, whatever he self-identified as. The needs and wishes of the women for whom the shelter was intended were also dismissed as transphobic in the government's need to be seen as politically correct or woke. Similarly, the government of British Columbia recently stated that a local gym did not have the right to insist that a formerly male transgender person use its mixed gender area rather than its women-only area. The transgender person has stated a desire to use the women's area because of feeling intimidated by the, quote, buff guys in the mixed gender area. Apparently, it's never occurred to this person that he is the one doing the intimidating. Every woman in the women-only area is potentially intimidated by his presence, as someone who grew up male and so may be bigger and stronger than any of them. While I have no idea how big or strong this particular person is, this is not an individual issue. If he is let in, then he establishes a precedent and opens the door for more buff guys to enter women's safe space. This complete lack of concern for others is not surprising. As we've already seen, the transgender movement has repeatedly demonstrated its commitment to its unspoken premise that nobody has any valid rights or needs except them. Potentially, any violent abuser or rapist could gain access to a treasure trove of new victims just by declaring that he now thinks of himself as female, particularly since this self-identification is currently accepted with no medical confirmation. This scenario is not hypothetical. Hundreds of male convicts have already applied for transfers to women's prisons by suddenly self-identifying as female. The safe space that women fought to create is under threat. For example, in Scotland, Isla Bryson was convicted in January 2023 of the rapes of 2 women, but was remanded to a women's prison after beginning transgender hormone treatments, despite the protests of many Scottish women. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon publicly supported this move and other transgender-inspired legislation, which made her so unpopular that she was forced to resign from her position in February 2023. Within a single month, she went from being the undisputed leader of her party and her country to declaring that her political career was over. Collateral damage of the transgender movement. As Abigail Schreier, author of Irreversible Damage, has said, the authorities' uncritical acceptance of transgenderism constitutes, quote, the cowardly surrender of women's welfare as a sacrifice to the woke gods, and it is wrong. Apparently, many Scots agree with her. Moreover, this is not the only way in which transgenderism has undermined the accomplishments of feminism. From its very origins, the women's movement has fought for women's right to control over their own bodies. They have fought against male politicians who've passed laws banning birth control and abortion, and they've fought against male doctors who have medicalized women's problems and then controlled them by claiming to treat imaginary women's ailments like hysteria. Transgenderism is just another form of the medicalization of women, taking men's control over women's bodies to a whole new level. Indeed, the transgender movement has directly attacked feminism with the 2008 invention of the acronym TERF, which stands for Transgender Exclusionary Radical Feminist. Radical feminism, as I explain in my talks on feminism, is a specific branch of feminist theory held by only a minority of feminists. But the term has been applied to any feminist, or indeed any woman, who refuses to accept that transgender men are women or that they should be allowed into women's spaces. TERF creator Viv Smythe has claimed that the term was intended to be a, quote, technically neutral description, but it never was. It was immediately used in a derogatory manner, and it has been described as insulting, abusive, pejorative, a slur, and even outright hate speech. Those labelled as TERFs have universally declared that the term is offensive. Catherine Bennett has described the word as, quote, a bullying tool which has already succeeded in repressing speech. Claire Hyken has noted that the term has become part of a, quote, violent rhetoric. The internet already contains numerous postings which incite people to punch a TERF or even kill a TERF, alongside graphic depictions of violence aimed at women labelled as TERFs. While such campaigns of hatred and violence are, presumably, organised only by a minority of activists, they speak for the movement as a whole. Every social movement consists of a silent majority and a vocal minority. Although the internet is available for anyone to publicly express their views, I have yet to hear of a single transgender person publicly dissociating themselves from or denouncing the abusive tactics of the movement's leadership. This means that every transgender person is complicit in this hatred and violence, even if they do not explicitly join in, and so are equally guilty of it. It is ironic and sad that the transgender movement, which began by opposing violence levelled at transgender persons, is now itself inciting violence against anyone who opposes it, particularly women. The gay rights movement is the one that the transgender movement has most explicitly hijacked. Indeed, gays have even been redefined to accommodate transgenderism. Homosexuality has been turned into LGBTQ, etc., in order to argue that transgender rights are just an extension of gay rights. Supposedly, they're all alphabet people together. Moreover, if someone raises the possibility that transgenderism is a mental illness, the immediate response from transgender activists is invariably to point out that homosexuality was also defined as a mental illness until quite recently, but is now recognized as a human right. However, just because this development was appropriate for homosexuality does not mean that it is appropriate for transgenderism. Just because homosexuality is not a mental illness does not prove that transgenderism is not, any more than it proves that schizophrenia or paranoia are not. Should all mental illnesses be reclassified as human rights because homosexuality was? I don't think so. The problem with this comparison is that, despite surface similarities, transgenderism is not the same kind of thing as homosexuality. On the contrary, it is the exact opposite. Homosexuality is natural. Transgenderism is artificial. Homosexuality has always been a part of human sexuality. Transgenderism is a recent invention made possible by modern medicine. Homosexuality involves the acceptance of yourself and your body's sexual desires. You accept that your body is attracted to persons of the same sex, even though this is a minority position. Transgenderism consists of the complete rejection of yourself and your body. You use chemicals and radical surgery to turn your body into something that it has not been born as. To put it bluntly, homosexuality does not involve getting your genitals amputated. Transgenderism does. Homosexuality and transgenderism have even become alternatives. If you're not heterosexual, then are you homosexual or transgender? The majority of those who flirt with transgenderism eventually decide that they are just homosexual and that this is the source of their gender confusion. The true comparison between transgenderism and homosexuality is that transgenderism is a politically correct form of the pseudo-scientific conversion therapy used to supposedly cure homosexuals and turn them into heterosexuals. Like the transgender procedure, conversion therapy begins with therapy and counseling, but when that is unsuccessful, it proceeds with surgery and drugs. Conversion therapy has been denounced and/or banned throughout most of the Western world, and the transgender procedure should be placed in the same category. With its insistence on a medical and surgical solution to a gender identity issue, transgenderism is actually setting back gay rights, not advancing them. It promotes the belief that homosexuality should also be treated with surgery and drugs. Transgender proponents have also piggybacked on the Indigenous Rights movement with the invention of the term two-spirit and the accompanying claim that Indigenous people have known about and accepted transgenderism from time immemorial. This is completely false. The concept and term two-spirit was invented by transgender activists in English in 1990. It is supposedly based on terms found in a number of native languages. However, this claim is problematic. Some of these terms mean man who dresses as a woman, or vice versa. In other words, a transvestite. But as I've said before, transvestism and transgenderism are not the same. Other terms mean man who loves men or woman who loves women, in other words, homosexual. But homosexuality and transgenderism are not the same. Still, other terms claimed by the movement have no connection to transgenderism that I can see. For example, the Arapaho term Hajujan means rotten bone, and the term Mijoge, used by several First Nations, means instructed by the moon. But the most common problem, as with many of the claims of the transgender movement, is a confusion between gender roles and gender identity. Tribal societies normally have a strict gender division of labor. There are men's jobs and women's jobs. In hunting and gathering societies, men hunt and women gather. However, sometimes exceptions have to be made. For example, a man may be injured and unable to hunt, so he joins the women in gathering. The Aleut nation has the term Ayagiguj, which means man transformed into a woman. Since the transgender procedure did not exist in tribal society, this transformation could only have been accomplished by injury or some similar drastic event. Tribal culture is based on respect. So such a man is still to be respected and is not to be looked down on because he's doing women's work, and so has taken on the social roles of both man and woman. On the flip side of this, there have always been exceptionally strong women who have hunted and fought alongside the men. And so several nations contain terms which mean hunter woman or warrior woman. However, adopting some aspects of the other gender role does not mean that either the individual or the tribe believes that they are really the other gender. Just because a woman goes hunting does not mean that she is transgender. Modern peoples in several African tribes who've been told about transgenderism have had two reactions. The first is to laugh, since the idea is simply ludicrous to them. On being assured that Western people really do have this done, the second reaction is to be deeply offended. In tribal culture, the Creator made us all as we are, men and women. To attempt to change this is to defy the will of the Creator. Traditional, tribal, cultural, and spiritual beliefs do not support transgenderism. Early tribal people would never have had transgender surgery even if such a thing had existed in their societies, which of course it did not. Transgender activists have engaged in cultural appropriation. They have twisted, used, and insulted traditional indigenous culture in redefining it to suit their own purposes. Despite these problems, the transgender movement has successfully presented itself as a human rights movement to the general public. They have attached transgenderism to the much broader struggle for minority rights and the elimination of prejudice and discrimination. This is a position which is easy to understand and has broad appeal, especially to those who consider themselves socially progressive. It is the position currently held by the majority of Western society. However, not everyone accepts the movement's self-definition. Some persons, including myself, have adopted another position. This one argues that transgenderism is a mental illness. Accepting the claims of transgender activists is accepting the self-diagnosis of mental patients, which is literally an insane thing to do. Accepting claims that a person is really the other gender is just like accepting claims that a person is really Napoleon. There are many kinds of delusional thought. Transgenderism is just one of them. The only reason there's any doubt about this is because most forms of mental illness isolate their sufferers. But transgender persons, largely thanks to the internet, have got together and organized themselves into an effective lobby group. While supporters of transgenderism see themselves as supporting human rights, in reality, they're simply making this illness worse, not better. They've put themselves in the position of enablers to the mentally ill. Transgenderism may also be defined as a disconnect or strain between a person's body and mind. There are two possible ways to deal with this problem: change the body or change the mind. Surgery and chemicals change the body, but it would be much less invasive and much more beneficial to change the mind. If a person is unhappy in their body, then the solution is to teach them to accept their body and be happy in it, as Dr. Zucker and his clinic used to do, not to take a scalpel to them. If a 6-foot man insists that he is Napoleon, the solution is not surgery to make him shorter, even though this can now be done. Transgenderism consists solely of the belief that one is transgender, and beliefs can be changed. There is no physical, objective, medical problem that transgender surgery addresses. The human body grows as a single organism. The argument that one could have a male brain in a female body is as meaningless as arguing that someone has a male kidney or a male liver in a female body. Even if there were found to be a physical problem, such as a hormonal imbalance, say, a much less invasive treatment could surely be developed than the massive surgery and drug regime involved in transgenderism. But as far as we currently know, this is a subjective problem which should be dealt with by subjective measures. In other words, the solution is not surgery, but therapy. The problem for therapists today is that their work is being undermined by the current social acceptance of transgenderism. As the saying goes, the first step in curing a problem has to be accepting that you have a problem. But persons with a mental illness will never accept a clinical diagnosis of mental illness when millions of people are telling them that They're not mentally ill, they're actually heroes in the struggle for human rights. Most people prefer to hear what they want to hear rather than listen to an unpleasant truth. And so, persons who think of themselves as transgender are increasingly abandoning therapists who challenge their assumptions for surgeons who support them. Indeed, therapists like Dr. Jordan Peterson have been pressured into closing their practices. More than this, in some jurisdictions, pressure from the transgender movement has actually led to the criminalization of therapists who try to help children accept their biological identity instead of getting surgery, by calling their work, quote, reparative therapy and identifying it with conversion therapy, even though, as I've already said, this is the exact opposite of the truth. It is the transgender procedure that mutilates the human body like conversion therapy, not psychotherapy, which is non-invasive and beneficial. But such legal bans make it impossible for confused children and their parents to find genuine help. The transgender procedure is presented as a so-called cure for a medical problem. Once more, the reality is the exact opposite. Chemicals and surgery turn the body into something it was never meant to be. It is inevitable that this will lead to health problems, and experience has confirmed this. Persons who have this surgery are setting themselves up for a lifetime of health problems, including increased risk of cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, cancer, cardiac arrest, and a wide variety of other issues. While some are lucky and avoid these, most suffer some long-term health damage, and some are literally never fully healthy again in their lives. I'll throw in a personal observation here. While I have never met a transgender person in the flesh, almost all of those I have seen on the internet have looked decidedly unhealthy. In addition, the cosmetic results of the procedure may trigger a harmful social reaction. An internet search for images of transgender persons shows that while some look convincingly like their intended gender, most look halfway between male and female. Helen Joyce, author of Trans When Ideology Meets Reality, has said that the procedure turns a man into a, quote, parody of a woman. Some persons find such a parody offensive. Transgender persons do not look normal, and this is primarily what both prompts and enables violence against them. Most trans bashers do not personally know their targets. They identify them by their unusual looks. As I've already said, I absolutely do not condone such violence. But, as a sociologist, I have to point out that persons whose very faces and bodies visibly flout social norms will inevitably face some form of social backlash. As I've already mentioned, violence towards transgender persons has increased as their social visibility has increased, despite the introduction of greater legal penalties against it. Ultimately, the whole concept of transgenderism is a sham. There is no such thing as real transgenderism because it is not actually possible to turn one gender into the other, even with all the wonders of modern medicine. People are born with male or female biology right down to their chromosomes. Women are XX, men are XY. No medical procedure can change this. The procedure is officially categorized as cosmetic surgery because its effects are purely cosmetic. It gives the appearance of being the other gender, but not the reality. It no more changes a person's gender than putting on makeup changes a man into a woman. For example, when a woman goes through this procedure, part of it involves removing a strip of flesh, usually from the woman's forearm, and grafting it between her legs. This does not actually turn a forearm into a penis. It cannot feel sexual pleasure, achieve orgasm, ejaculate, or inseminate, and can only attain a pretend erection if another surgical procedure implants balloons into it, which can then be inflated. Once more, this provides the appearance of sexual function, not the reality. As Helen Joyce put it, quote, "We are not made of meat Lego. Human body parts are not interchangeable. Persons who've gone through this procedure have not become transsexual, but more nearly asexual. Since they've not only been sterilized, it's difficult for them to have any sex at all. Having a lump of flesh grafted between her legs does not make a woman into a man any more than if she had it grafted on her nose. Similarly, having her breasts surgically removed does not make a woman into a man any more than having her arms amputated would. Such surgery does not and cannot make a woman into a man. It just makes her into a surgically mutilated woman. This is why Abigail Shrier has called transgenderism, quote, "the greatest medical scandal of this decade." It is also why I shall not enter into the transgender fantasy world by using the chosen term transitioning to describe this procedure. It is not possible to transition from one gender to the other. The only transition that takes place is from a healthy body to a mutilated body. The correct term for such a process is mutilation. And so that is the term that I have used and will continue to use to describe transgender surgery. Moreover, even by its own twisted logic, transgenderism is self-contradictory. It is based on the premise that biology doesn't matter. What matters is how you subjectively define yourself. But if biology does not matter, then why does the individual need to transform their biology through drugs and surgery? If the individual already thinks of themselves as being the other gender, then why do they need to have their genitals amputated? Either the subjective has priority over the objective, or it does not. Going through the transgender procedure just confirms that gender is primarily about biology, the very point that the transgender movement refuses to accept. That concludes what I have to say on the history of transgenderism. A transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.